just a reminder, this is week 2. If you didn't join us last week, Michelle is going to put in the chat link to the recording. We talked about how to find a mentor. And my name is Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence. Really happy that you're here to talk today about how to become a better mentor. I hope that you will lean into the content here, ask questions in the chat, or when it's time for Q&A, take yourself off mute and do so. And this will, of course, be just a touch and a taste. I would be overselling if I told you we could create fully competent mentors in half an hour. But instead, I want to really just give you a touch and a taste of how to really enhance your mentorship. We know that mentors help mentees grow into the person who has the capability, the confidence, and the competence to accomplish their goals. Last week, we talked about how learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of mentoring. And so today, as we talk about how to become a better mentor, we want to talk about really how do you lean into that learning and create a relationship in which learning can flourish and you can make both for mentor and for mentee. So the first thing we need to do is to clarify who's driving. What are the roles in a mentoring relationship and who's driving the relationship? So what we know is that in effective mentoring relationships, the mentee drives the relationship, right? This is where, in some ways, mentoring distinguishes itself from other modalities. Despite what many may think, it's not the mentor who drives the relationship. The mentee drives what the learning is. The mentor sets the tone and helps enable the learning, but ultimately it is the mentee who's driving the relationship. So what role does that mean that we play as mentors? And here is a maxim that I often use that helps us think through what the roles are here. Mentors push and mentees stretch. Mentors push and mentees stretch. The role of a mentor is to push the mentee beyond their comfort zone. And for the role of the mentee is to stretch beyond that comfort zone. What that means is it's incumbent upon the mentor to create a safe space where the mentee can stretch, where the mentee can show up fully, where there's trust that's built, where there's an environment in which learning can flourish. So let's talk a little bit about how to do that. And just to set the context for you, I want to share with you the mentoring cycle model that we use at Center for Mentoring Excellence. It was developed by Lois Zachary, and there's 4 phases to the mentoring cycle. These are 4 predictable phases in a mentoring relationship. And when you look at successful mentoring relationships, it's because they've hit each of these boxes or phases in the cycle, if you will. And I want you to also notice that there are 2-way arrows in between each phase here. Sometimes you got to go back in order to go forward. So let me just walk you through what those phases are so we can dig into how to become a better mentor in each of those phases. The first phase is not goal setting and goal getting. The first phase is preparation. It's about getting ready for the relationship, and it requires preparation of yourself as a mentor, and preparation of the relationship by getting to know one another. So we'll talk just a little bit about that. It's a time for reflection. It's a time for connection. It's a time for setting the foundation for trusting, open conversations in your mentoring relationship. And it takes intention. The next phase is negotiating. A lot of times we get pushback from this term, negotiating in a mentoring relationship, because it feels so legalistic or overly formal. But it's about establishing agreements. And the reason we call it negotiating is because the mentor and the mentee are co-creating the foundation of the mentoring relationship by setting agreements that work for both of them. So that's a really important phase. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about how to engage in this negotiation. The next phase is enabling growth. That's the goal setting and the goal getting phase. And so often mentoring pairs will skip preparation and they'll skip negotiation and they'll go right to the enabling growth phase. And that's a mistake because you really have not set the foundation for these open, trusting, and productive learning conversations. And in that case, very often mentoring conversations become transactional because you don't have the space for learning and trust. And the final phase is coming to closure, which we're not going to spend time on today. We'll talk a little bit about that next week, and there'll be space for Q&A on that in 2 weeks' time if you want to engage in that a little bit more. But coming to closure is an essential part of the mentoring relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean closing out the mentoring relationship. It means closing out the mentoring period, looking backward at what you've accomplished, appreciating each other and learning, and determining how you're going to move forward. And of course, the mentor has critical roles to play in each of that. But before you do any of that, let's go back to the preparation phase. And I want to talk a little bit about ways to prepare the relationship. And just a caution for you. How many of you, when you look to connect with somebody, connect over the things that you have in common, right? Oh, you read Harry Potter? I read Harry Potter. You love the Amor Tolls book? Yeah, me too. You went to this school? Me too. I lived in Chicago too, Erin. Let's connect over that, right? And we find ways immediately when we connect with people, we do it over the things that we have in common. But there is a danger in focusing and connecting over the ways, just the things that you have in common. And it really is that you implicitly are promoting conformity. I like you because you're like me. So let's talk about the ways that you're like me. Let me encourage that connection just over the things that we have in common. Very rarely do we connect over the ways in which we're different, our different interests, our different identities. And when we fail to do that, we miss creating authentic relationships over the ways and cherishing those differences. But if we focus only on the ways we're different, we really risk sort of fragmentation. So the solution here is to not just to focus on commonality and not just to focus on difference, but when you're looking to prepare the relationship, to talk about the things that you have in common and some of your differences so that you can really begin to leverage those differences. I am on a personal mission to eradicate from our parlance this term, we connected despite our differences, and substitute it with we connected because of our differences. And the skill of a good mentor is to learn how to do that, how to connect over differences. And the first step in doing that is to really think through self-awareness, really get comfortable and aware with the things that make you unique and different. I often ask participants in our workshops when we do this exercise to think about themselves as an iceberg. Think about their identity as an iceberg. And like an iceberg, there's so much more below the surface than above the surface. And yet, what's above the surface and what's below the surface affects the way we show up in the world and the way we view the world, the way the world shows up to us and the way we view the world. So for example, my own personal iceberg, you notice that I present as a woman, probably that I talk quickly and with my hands. I have short hair. If we were in person, and those who've met me know that I'm what we diplomatically call vertically challenged, which just means I'm short. All of these things you will have noticed about me and made judgments about me and affect the way I view the world and the way the world views me. And there's so much more below the surface. My family status, my values, my motivation, the way I learn, my racial identity, my religious beliefs, my political orientation, my sexual orientation that affects the way I show up in the world and the way the world shows up for me. One thing I often ask participants to do when they meet with their mentoring partners is to think about their own personal iceberg and to choose one item from above the waterline and one thing that's visible, and two from below that impact the way they show up in the world, and talk about how that might influence their mentoring relationship. So if you're looking for a great exercise to take this into practice, having that reflection time on your own and then with your mentoring partner can be a really great way to start to invite conversations about difference. Here's some other examples of categories that might be on your iceberg, some below, some above the waterline. Things to be thinking about. I love this one, birth order, right? Some of you may be students of birth order as well. I remember my very first class in law school, I raised my hand to contribute, and my law school professor said, "You're the youngest of two, aren't you?" It was wild. So that can also impact the way you show up in the world and the way the world views you. Here's another element of difference that I want to encourage you to consider. You can take a screenshot if you like, or of course, there'll be a recording with a link. These cultural dimensions come from the work of Frans Trompenaars in his book, and Charles Hampton Smith in their book, Riding the Waves of Culture. And they introduce really 9 cultural continuum. But I want to point out 4 that you can use as a way to do some self-reflection and then get to know your mentoring partner so you can start to set the foundation for trusting conversations across difference. These are 4 cultural continuum that, again, impact the way that we show up in our mentoring conversations, in our work lives, and our personal lives. The first continuum is that of directness and indirectness. Of course, if you are far to the left on the continuum here, you value direct communication and really getting to the point. Significantly, it's not just where you are on the continuum, but it's recognizing the assumptions and the judgments that you might make of folks who are in different places on the continuum. For example, if you are very far to the left on this idea of getting to the point directness, you may judge somebody who's very far to the right on indirectness as wasting time, not being focused enough, not valuing your time. Similarly, if you tend to value indirect communication, it's a cultural preference, you may view somebody who's direct as too blunt, not valuing the relationship because they're not interested in the things that surround things to cushion the message a little bit. So again, recognizing where you are on the continuum, where your mentoring partner might be, but also the judgments that you might make implicitly, unconsciously, about folks on other parts of the continuum. The next continuum is that of authority and autonomy. Do you value following direction, following orders, or determining your own best path? Here in North America, very typically in organizational contexts, we tend to value autonomy, not always true, but what your cultural context is on this can be really, really important. Again, think about the judgment that you might make. If you're high on authority, of somebody who's high on autonomy as being a bit of a cowboy or a cowgirl or a cowperson, right? It's a little bit of somebody who follows their own direction. Similarly, if you're high on autonomy, viewing somebody who's high on authority as a bit of an automaton or a robot or somebody who doesn't use their discretion. Again, these are assumptions and judgments that we make subconsciously that affect the way we interact with people based on their cultural for factors that might be based on their cultural orientation. It's really important to think through. 2 more quickly before we get to the next slide is emotional restraint and emotional expression. Perhaps you value, and this is why one of the reasons that we ask you to think about where you are at work versus at home. So many of us are much more emotionally expressive in our personal lives than in our work lives. What value do you place on withholding emotion? In the workplace, very often we view the expression of emotion as a sign of weakness or unprofessional. And yet in many cultures, the expression of emotion is a sign of investment in what it is that you're working on. And the judgment that we might make of folks who are withholding of emotion is that they are not invested, they're not caring. So really important, again, to articulate this. Team effectiveness and individual achievement. Again, do you value the team rising together. When I was in high school, I was an exchange student in Australia, in a small town in Australia. And this is actually not as true now in 2022 as it was in 1980 something. But in 1980 something, in this small town, it was a very collectivistic culture. I grew up in American suburbia. We're very high on individualistic culture. It was all about me getting the A and learning what it is I had to learn and achieving at all costs. And the view of that mentality in the collectivistic culture was that I viewed myself as too good for the group, and I wasn't interested in the team rising together. So you want to, again, think about where your viewpoint is, your natural tendency is here, your cultural orientation is, and have a conversation with your mentoring partner about where they are. So you really can meet one another where they are and notice some of those assumptions and preclude them. Another piece on preparation before we move further is thinking about how well you listen. Listen isn't just about hearing. And we are so bad, typically in this day and age, with all of these distractions. Listening is really important in setting the stage for mentees to drive the relationship, because if they feel like they are heard, they'll feel like they are seen, and they feel like they can contribute. So make sure that you're really paying attention and not faking attention, that you're not multitasking, that you put your phone away. You know, there was a study, interestingly, I mean, so many of us, when we're having conversations, we'll take our phone and put it on the table upside down. There was a study that showed that even that act of having your phone out on the table, even if it's turned down, decreases the effectiveness of conversations by 20 some odd %. So really important to be fully present, not to become too argumentative, to express your emotion, but not to become defensive or argumentative, to withhold judgment of the speaker's message or delivery. Really important not to tune out, to listen just for the facts, to listen for the word. I like to say for the words and the music. You really want to be able to hear it. So many of us tend to interrupt to insert our point of view. This is a cultural characteristic of me. I get very excited and I like to jump in and ask questions. And yet really listening requires the pause, letting folks finish. Important to not just to listen to find your own opening, but to listen to hear the message. And of course, you don't want to be thinking while somebody's talking about what it is your response is going to be, because you'll miss the message entirely. Okay, so that's a little bit about preparation. There are 3 things that mentees are looking for from their mentor. And I want to dive into these 3 things: support, vision, and challenge. And to get you thinking about ways to provide these things to your mentee. So we know that mentees are looking for mentors to support their growth and development. So I want to challenge you, encourage you to think through specific things you can do or say to support your mentee's growth and development. Part of providing support is to provide a sounding board, is to ask challenging questions, to really listen, to set an environment of trust. We'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. If you can think of it, you can think of other ways that you can support your mentee's growth and development. Put that in the chat. What other things can you do or say to support your mentee's growth and development? Some people say providing additional access to resources, making connections for them, having good body language when in discussions. Yeah, Jennifer, absolutely. Creating a safe space to learn and reflect, says Carol. That creating that sense of safety is so, so, so important. Okay. Asking questions instead of telling. Yeah, thanks, BJ, absolutely. So the first thing is, and having integrity so that they can count on you with trust, validating their ideas. Stephanie says, don't just focus on the work, but also ask about the things they enjoy outside of work. That is all about getting to know who to lower that waterline on the iceberg so you can have more of an authentic relationship. Fantastic. And Stephanie says, having mutual learning, letting them know you can learn from them too. Absolutely. Second thing that mentees need from their mentors is a help crystallizing, developing, and realizing their vision, seeing what's possible, exploring the path. Mentees drive the learning, but mentors help mentees set the vision. One way that a mentor can push is to help the mentee develop, realize, and crystallize their career vision. Run possibilities past them. Help them think about what possibilities there might be. Help connect them with people who may be experiencing things that they haven't yet thought of. Have them think through what it is they want to be doing in the future. I discourage you from saying, what does it look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? That is an eternity. If a mentee does not have a clear vision, it helps to keep it more close, to narrow the horizon, to say, what does 3 years from now look like? What are you doing? Who are you? How are you spending your time? Who's around you? And you can start to help develop and realize that career vision that way. And the final thing, to facilitate mentee learning, we talked about support, we talked about vision, is this idea of challenge. I want you to think through what specific things you can do or say to challenge your mentee in ways that will facilitate their growth and development. It is so important as a mentor to help your mentee feel comfortably uncomfortable. Feel comfortably uncomfortable, get outside of their comfort zone. You can be a sounding board. You can role play difficult conversations. You can give your mentee a stretch assignment. You can push them to think through things that where their strengths are that they can develop, where their shortcomings might be that they can work on. Great ways to challenge your mentee. And another way to challenge your mentee is to provide, request, and accept feedback. So you'll provide them feedback on how it is they are achieving their goals, but to request and accept feedback and invite them to share feedback with you about how you can improve your mentoring relationship. Why does that fall under challenge for me? Well, because very often that's something that mentees are quite uncomfortable doing. But if they're going to drive the relationship, they need to have a say-so in how the relationship is going, and really encouraging that feedback is a key hallmark. A key hallmark, that might be gilding the lily, is a hallmark of a great mentoring relationship. Okay, one more point I want to make before I open it to questions is this idea of trust. Good mentoring relationships must have trust, and they thrive on trust. And there really are many aspects of trust in mentoring. The first aspect is self-trust. It's your trust as a mentor in yourself, in your ability to help provide support, vision, and challenge, or to provide support, vision, and challenge for your mentee, in your own ability to show up for your mentee, to help push them a little bit outside their comfort zone, and to be a sounding board and a safety net and a laboratory for their learning. The second element of trust is trust in one another. And you establish trust in one another by demonstrating the ability to show up and to be a good mentor, in demonstrating benevolence, which is the care for and the fact that your mentee's interest is your interest as well, and in demonstrating integrity. Ability, benevolence, and integrity. And integrity is showing up when you say you're going to show up, remembering what happens conversation to conversation. You can do that by keeping a mentoring journal, taking notes, really listening, by making connections and sharing of your network, by sharing your experience, by sharing your own challenges, and really lowering your own waterline, by being vulnerable, says Stephanie, absolutely. And the third element of trust is trust in mentoring. And it's essential that both you and your mentee trust that mentoring is a learning and a growth opportunity for each of you, and individually, and for both of you collectively. So these elements of trust are huge, and it really requires creating psychological safety, creating an environment where it's safe to learn, safe to make mistakes, safe to ask questions, safe to challenge. So there is much more to that. I want to open it up for questions. While you're thinking of your questions, I want to just encourage you to join us next week where we dive a little bit more into the negotiation and the enabling growth phase. And then again, in 2 weeks for Q&A, we'll have a little extra time for that. You can just bring your questions. But at this point, what questions do you have about how to be a better mentor, or comments? I know there's a lot of wisdom in this room as well.
Raise a quick question. I admittedly have a bad habit of doing just what you say not to do, and that is thinking about what my response is and wanting to talk before the other person gets done. And I find myself saying, oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Mm-hmm. So just in full transparency, is there any tidbits or recommendations you would have, not even just for mentoring, but just in, all of aspects of my work with my colleagues and outside of work, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's a great question. So here's a tip that I use because I, like you, tend to jump in, get excited, and cut people off. Diane says, count 10 seconds and be okay with the silence. So silence is a great tool. What I do is I either think through my mouth or I think through my pen. So I'll often keep a notebook open and I'll write a couple words that triggered the thought that I just had. And then I wait 3 or 4 seconds when the person is done, and I'll usually say, I'm struck by the comment that you said, blah, 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 or the words when you said, and reframe what it is that they said, and then say, and it triggered for me this, and then you go back to your notes. So use your pen as a surrogate for your mouth. So that you can record what was in your head and then continue really listening, and the person will feel heard. And sometimes what I'll do is I say, I hear that you said, Stephanie, we'll just use the example. I hear that you said that you often find yourself interrupting and are looking for tips. And if I heard that right, here's what I have to offer. So that's a great tip. Tamara, my colleague in mentoring, says, I've worked to improve my listening skills as a mentor and a facilitator. Covey's principle of seek first to understand before you seek to be understood has been a powerful reminder. Absolutely. Fantastic. Great point, Tamara. Thank you so much. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts?
This is Erin. I do have a question. This was a really great session, a lot of great information. So thank you very much for that. One of the things that came up during our piloting program is, some mentees, and I think this goes along with building that trust, is, how, in it being okay that if a mentee did come to their mentor and say, I don't know, I think I'm looking outside of the organization. I mean, you want to be good stewards of the organization, right? And keep your talent. But then sometimes, there aren't those opportunities that the mentee is seeking. And, how do you help them work through that or create that trusting space where you can, have those frank, authentic conversations, knowing that you could be helping this mentee out of the organization and, being okay with that. And,
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Erin. And if I hear the question right, it's, what happens if your mentees, what's in their career interest and in their development interest isn't in the same interest as the organization? That's the beauty of the mentoring relationship. And the reason, not the only reason, but the primary reason why I suggest not having a supervisor also be your mentor, because there's really a conflict of interest there. And we've seen that happen a number of times. So tune in next week for the negotiation phase, because setting that expectation at the outset of, look, in this mentoring relationship, Erin, my primary interest is in your development. I know that might not be in the interest of our organization, and that's okay. This is a safe space. And having confidentiality agreements around that and what will be discussed and what won't be discussed is going to be really, really important. Glenn asks, how do you get mentees to put in enough time and effort? Again, that's something that happens in the negotiation phase. And then you can always, once you set those agreements, you can revisit those if the expectation is not and the commitment is not being met? Great question, Glenn. Tune in next week for more on that. Trisha asks, curious if most folks here are mentors through formal, corporate, or informal. Where's the greatest need and how to find them? Oh, I love it. I love that question. Formal and informal, not formal or informal. There are mentors, need for mentors really in all different spaces. Both formal and informal have a lot of benefits. And I don't know everybody here, but as I'm looking around, there's really a mix here of informal, formal, and corporate from what I know, but folks can absolutely add their experience, please, in the chat. Andrea, for example, says formal mentoring for nursing new graduate nurses within a hospital context. Janelle asked, will the recording be shared? Absolutely. Michelle also put in the chat the link to our YouTube channel where things will be housed, but we're going to be emailing around the recording. So I know we're at time. These are designed to be short and sweet, which means we can't reach everything, but come back next week and the week following. In 2 weeks, it'll be a virtual brown bag. So bring your questions. We'll have lots of time, a full hour, to be addressing those questions as well. Thanks for joining us. Happy Mentoring Month, and we hope to see you next week.